The house that rotted alone in Appalachia held the final breath of a doomed bloodline. Deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to the valleys like unwanted memories, there stood a structure that time had forgotten. The Calloway House, a decaying monument to a family that had turned its back on the outside world for nearly a century. It was the summer of 1987, when social worker Margaret Brennan first received the anonymous call. A trembling voice on the other end spoke of children who had never seen a school, adults who could barely speak, and a family that had lived in complete isolation since the 1890s. The caller hung up before Margaret could ask questions, but the address remained burned into her notepad: 4501 Crooked Hollow Road, Harlan County. Margaret had worked in Appalachian communities for 15 years. She had seen poverty that would break most people's hearts. She had witnessed families struggling against impossible odds in forgotten corners of America, but nothing could have prepared her for what waited at the end of that winding dirt road. The drive took 3 hours from the county office. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to mud and exposed rock. Ancient trees formed a canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each mile. The radio had lost signal 20 minutes back. The only sound was the crunch of tires on the deteriorating path and her own breathing. Then she saw it. The Calloway house emerged from the trees like a corpse rising from a grave. The structure leaned severely to the left, its foundation surrendered to decades of mountain erosion. Windows were covered with warped planks and tattered cloth. The roof had collapsed in sections, exposing blackened beams to the sky. The porch sagged dangerously, its steps rotted through in places. But it was the smell that hit her first. Even from the car, with windows rolled up, the stench penetrated. Decay. Waste, something fundamentally wrong with the air itself. Margaret stepped out of her vehicle, her shoes sinking into mud mixed with things she preferred not to identify. The front yard was a disaster of rusted tools, broken furniture, and what appeared to be animal bones scattered among overgrown weeds. A chicken coop had collapsed years ago, its wire cage now wrapped around rotting wood like a metallic vine. She called out, "Hello? My name is Margaret Brennan. I'm from the county social services. I'm here to help." Silence. Then movement. A curtain twitched in one of the upper windows. Margaret's heart pounded. She took a step closer to the porch, careful to test each board before putting her full weight down. The front door opened with a sound like breaking bones. A woman appeared. She might have been 30. She might have been 60. Her face bore the marks of a life lived in shadow. Her eyes sat too far apart, her jaw protruded at an unnatural angle, and her teeth, what remained of them, overlapped in chaotic patterns. She wore a dress that might have been white decades ago, but was now a patchwork of stains and tears. "Who sent you?" The woman's voice was thick, her words formed with difficulty around her misshapen mouth. "A concerned citizen called our office," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady and kind. "I'm here to make sure everyone is safe and healthy. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Calloway." The woman's hands twisted together nervously. "We don't need no help. We take care of our own." "I understand, Sarah. But the law requires that I check on the welfare of anyone living in this household, especially children. Are there children here?" Sarah's eyes darted back into the darkness of the house. Margaret heard sounds, shuffling, whispers, the crying of an infant. "How many people live here, Sarah?" "Just family. Always been just family." Margaret climbed onto the porch, ignoring the way it groaned under her weight. She needed to see inside. She needed to document what was happening here. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness beyond the doorway, shapes began to emerge, figures huddled in corners. The glint of eyes watching from doorways, the count started in her head. 5, 7, 10. 12 people, maybe more, living in this rotting structure. The interior was worse than the exterior. Holes in the floor revealed the crawl space beneath, where rainwater had pooled into stagnant ponds. The walls were black with mold. Trash and waste covered every surface. There was no running water, no electricity. The family had been living like this for generations. An elderly man shuffled forward from the shadows. His back was curved severely, forcing him to walk at an angle. His hands shook with what Margaret recognized as neurological damage. When he spoke, his voice came out in grunts and partial words that Sarah had to translate. "That's Daddy," Sarah explained. "He's been head of the family since Granddaddy passed in 72. He says we don't want trouble. We live quiet. We don't bother nobody." Margaret pulled out her notebook with trembling hands. "Sarah, I need to understand the family structure here. Who is related to whom? And where are the children?" What Sarah revealed in the next 20 minutes would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. The Calloway family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a circle, a closed loop that had been repeating itself for 4 generations. It started in 1891, when brothers Thomas and William Calloway brought their sister Rebecca into these mountains to escape a scandal in Virginia. They built this house together, the 3 of them, miles from the nearest town. They told themselves they were starting fresh, creating something pure, something untouched by the corrupting influence of outsiders. Thomas married Rebecca. William never left. The 3 lived together, worked the land together, and when children came, they were raised to believe that the outside world was dangerous, sinful, and diseased. The only safety was within the family. The only pure blood was Calloway blood. When those children grew, they married each other, cousins to cousins. When there weren't enough cousins, siblings to siblings, the pattern repeated with each generation, tightening the genetic loop with every union. The bloodline became more concentrated, more damaged, more desperate. Sarah led Margaret through the house, showing her the reality of 4 generations of inbreeding. In one room, 3 children sat rocking back and forth, unable to speak or make eye contact. Their ages ranged from perhaps 5 to 12, but cognitive development had stopped years ago for all of them. One had a severely cleft palate that had never been repaired. Another had club feet that bent at impossible angles. In another room, Margaret found a young woman, maybe 20 years old, lying on a filthy mattress. She was heavily pregnant. Her sister, Sarah, explained, though also her cousin, her niece, and distantly her grandmother through the twisted branches of the family tree. The young woman's eyes were clouded with cataracts. Her limbs were thin as branches. She reached out when Margaret approached, grabbing her hand with surprising strength. "Help us," she whispered. "Please help us. Confira si já é inscrito neste canal. Because what you're about to discover will expose the darkest secrets that families tried to bury forever, and you need to be here for every revelation." Margaret Brennan sat in her car for 15 minutes after leaving the Calloway house that first day, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what she had witnessed. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She had filled 3 notebooks with observations, taken 2 rolls of photographs with her department camera, and collected enough documentation to justify immediate intervention. But she also knew that removing this family from their home would be the beginning of something much larger and more painful. Back at the county office, she assembled a team. Dr. Raymond Foster, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky. Linda Matthews, a registered nurse with experience in rural health crises. Deputy Sheriff Tom Hackett, who would provide security and legal authority, and herself, who would coordinate the entire operation. They would return to Crooked Hollow Road in 3 days. Dr. Foster spent those 3 days preparing Margaret for what they were likely to find from a medical and genetic perspective. He spread charts across the conference room table, showing her how genetic diversity functions like a shield against inherited diseases and mutations. Every human carries recessive genes for various conditions, he explained. But when two unrelated people have children, the chances of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive gene are relatively low. But when you have a closed population, Dr. Foster continued, his finger tracing lines on a genetic probability chart, especially one practicing sustained close relative reproduction over multiple generations, those harmful recessives get concentrated. They amplify. Generation by generation, the genetic load becomes heavier. He showed her photographs from similar cases throughout history, the royal families of Europe, where cousin marriages had produced haemophilia that passed through generations like a curse, isolated communities in Switzerland and Japan where genetic disorders had reached crisis levels, the Whitaker family of West Virginia, discovered in the 1970s and bearing eerily similar markers to what Margaret had described seeing. The Calloways have been doing this since 1891, Margaret said quietly. That's almost a century, 4, maybe 5 generations. Dr. Foster nodded grimly. With each generation, the probability of genetic disorders increases exponentially. We're likely looking at elevated rates of cognitive disabilities, physical deformities, organ malformations, increased infant mortality, reduced fertility, and shortened lifespans. The wonder isn't that they're struggling. The wonder is that they've survived at all. The second visit to Crooked Hollow Road took place on a Wednesday morning in late June. The team arrived in 2 vehicles, bringing medical supplies, testing equipment, and legal documentation. Sarah Calloway met them on the porch, her expression caught between fear and something that might have been relief. "Daddy says you can come in," she told them, "but he wants to know if you're going to take us away." "We're here to help, Sarah," Margaret said gently, "but that help might mean some changes. Will you let us examine everyone, make sure people get the medical care they need?" The examination process took 6 hours. Dr. Foster and Nurse Matthews worked methodically through the household, documenting each family member's condition. What they found confirmed Dr. Foster's worst predictions and exceeded them. Of the 14 people living in the house, not a single individual was without significant health issues. The elderly patriarch, Joshua Calloway, suffered from severe spinal curvature, early-onset dementia, and a heart condition that should have killed him years ago. His wife, who was also his first cousin, had died 2 years earlier from organ failure at age 53. The middle generation showed even more pronounced effects. All 6 adults displayed varying degrees of cognitive impairment. 3 had significant physical deformities. 2 were nearly blind. One man, Sarah's brother-husband Caleb, could barely walk due to joint malformations that had worsened over his 32 years. But it was the children who broke the team's hearts. 7 children between the ages of 2 and 14 lived in that house. Not one could read or write. Not one had received any medical care since birth. 5 were nonverbal or had severe speech impediments. 4 had physical deformities, ranging from cleft palates to missing digits to skeletal abnormalities. The youngest, a 2-year-old girl, had been born with her internal organs partially outside her body, a condition called omphalocele that typically requires immediate surgical intervention. The family had wrapped her in cloth and prayed. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived. Dr. Foster drew blood samples from each family member, carefully labeling vials that would be sent to specialized laboratories in Louisville and Lexington. The genetic analysis would take months, but he already knew what the results would show. Homozygosity levels far beyond anything seen in healthy populations, markers for dozens of inherited conditions, a gene pool so narrow and shallow that it was essentially a puddle. While the medical team worked, Deputy Hackett and Margaret conducted interviews, piecing together the family's history. They learned that the isolation had been both chosen and enforced. Joshua's father had taught him that the outside world was filled with sinners and devils, that strangers carried diseases that could destroy pure bloodlines, that the only way to preserve the Calloway name and legacy was to keep it within the family. But there had been others who had tried to leave. Sarah remembered whispered stories about her aunt Rebecca, who had run away when Sarah was small. Joshua had tracked Rebecca down in the town of Harlan, 12 miles away. He brought her back. Sarah didn't know what happened next, but Aunt Rebecca never tried to leave again. She had died during childbirth 2 years later, at age 24. The family survived on government assistance checks that Joshua collected monthly, though he told his children the money came from the land. They hunted, grew minimal vegetables in a failing garden, and supplemented with expired food donated by a church group that left supplies at the end of the road without ever coming close enough to see how the family really lived. As the sun began to set, Margaret made the decision she had been dreading. She called Child Protective Services. The children would need to be removed immediately. The adults would be offered placement in assisted living facilities and medical treatment. The Calloway house would be condemned. Sarah overheard the call. She ran to her father, speaking in the half-language they had developed, part English and part grunts and gestures. Joshua's face contorted with rage and terror. He struggled to his feet, his twisted spine making every movement agony. "You can't take them!" Sarah screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that sent the children crying into corners. "This is our home. This is our family. You got no right." "Sarah, please understand." Margaret approached carefully, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "The children need medical care. They need education. They need a chance at life beyond these walls." "This is life!" Sarah's face was wet with tears, snot running from her misshapen nose. "This is all we know! You're going to kill us by spreading us out! Family has to stay together!" But the law was clear. The children were in immediate danger. The adults were incapable of providing adequate care. By nightfall, 3 vehicles from Child Protective Services had arrived. The children were gathered, crying and clinging to their parents, and placed in cars that would take them to emergency foster placements and hospitals. The sound of their screams echoed through the mountains long after the vehicles disappeared down Crooked Hollow Road. The removal of the Calloway children made local news. Headlines in the Harlan Daily Enterprise read, "Family of 14 discovered living in squalor, and generations of isolation end in emergency intervention." But the reporters didn't know the full story. They didn't understand the genetic catastrophe that had unfolded in those mountains. They couldn't comprehend the price that had been paid for purity. Margaret Brennan spent the following weeks coordinating care for the scattered family members. The children were placed in specialized foster homes and medical facilities across Kentucky. The adults were divided between assisted living centers and group homes, designed for people with developmental disabilities. Only Joshua refused to leave the property. He remained in the rotting house, alone for the first time in his 71 years. Dr. Foster's genetic analysis came back 6 weeks after the initial intervention. He spread the results across Margaret's desk with hands that trembled slightly. The numbers were stark, clinical, devastating. "The coefficient of inbreeding for the youngest generation is 0.375, he explained. "That's equivalent to what you'd see if a father reproduced with his own daughter. The human genome simply cannot sustain this level of homozygosity without catastrophic consequences." The report detailed specific genetic markers. The Calloway family showed elevated frequencies of alleles associated with cognitive impairment, skeletal dysplasia, immune system deficiencies, and organ malformations. Several children carried genes for fatal childhood diseases that would have manifested within a few years. 3 had markers for early-onset Alzheimer's disease. All showed signs of accumulated genetic load that would impact every aspect of their lives. "There's something else," Dr. Foster said quietly. "The fertility data. The family should have died out naturally within another generation or two. The women are showing signs of reproductive failure. Miscarriage rates in Sarah's generation were over 70%. The children who did survive to birth had a 30% mortality rate in the first year of life. Nature was attempting to close this genetic experiment through attrition. Margaret felt sick. So the family was dying anyway, slowly suffocating under the weight of their own genes. Exactly. What we're seeing here is evolution in reverse, or rather evolution working exactly as designed, eliminating genetic combinations that cannot sustain life. But human will, human stubbornness, kept pushing against that biological reality. The children's adaptation to the outside world proved extraordinarily difficult. The 7-year-old boy, named Jeremiah, screamed for 16 straight hours when placed in his foster home. He had never slept alone. He had never been in a building with electric lights. The sound of traffic terrified him. His foster mother, a patient woman named Carol, who had raised troubled children for 20 years, called Margaret in tears. "He doesn't understand anything," Carol said. "He doesn't know how to use a toilet. He's afraid of running water. He tried to bite me when I gave him clean clothes. Margaret, I want to help, but I don't know if I can reach him." Similar reports came from every placement. The children were feral in their fear and confusion. The concept of strangers showing kindness made no sense in their worldview. Food that didn't come from hunting or foraging seemed suspicious. The structure and routine of normal life felt like prison. The two oldest children, 16-year-old Mary and 14-year-old Ruth, were placed together in a residential treatment facility in Lexington. A therapist named Dr. Helen Park worked with them daily, trying to help them process the trauma of removal while also teaching basic life skills. It was during one of these sessions that Dr. Park made a discovery that changed her understanding of the case. Mary, who could speak more clearly than her younger siblings, revealed that she had known life wasn't supposed to be the way it was in the Calloway house. She had found magazines that had blown onto the property years ago. She had seen pictures of other families, other homes, other ways of living. "I tried to tell Mama," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said we should go to the town. We should meet other people. She hit me. She said I had sin in my heart. She said outsiders would destroy us." Dr. Park leaned forward. "Mary, did you ever try to leave?" The girl's face crumpled. "Once, when I was 12. I walked down the road for 3 hours. I got to where the pavement started. There was a car coming. A lady in the car. She slowed down like she was going to stop, and I got so scared. Everything Daddy and Mama said about outsiders came flooding back. I ran back into the woods. I ran all the way home." The tragedy of missed chances hung in the air like smoke. How many times had someone driven past Crooked Hollow Road without turning down it? How many hunters or hikers had glimpsed the property and decided it wasn't their business? How many opportunities for intervention had slipped away while generations suffered? At this moment, I want you to think about Mary's words and feel the weight of her trapped childhood. Leave a comment with this exact phrase. She deserved a chance to choose her own path. Let the world know that you see these forgotten victims. Back in Harlan County, Margaret received a call from Deputy Hackett. Joshua Calloway had been found dead in the house on Crooked Hollow Road. A neighbor who occasionally dropped off supplies had noticed the smell and called authorities. When they entered the structure, they found Joshua in his bed, which had collapsed through the rotted floor. He had been dead for approximately 3 days. The coroner's report listed cause of death as heart failure, but Margaret knew better. Joshua had died of a broken bloodline. The weight of 4 generations of genetic catastrophe had finally crushed the last breath from the family patriarch. But there was something else found in the house, something that Deputy Hackett brought to Margaret in a sealed evidence bag. A journal, handwritten, water-damaged, but still legible. The diary of Rebecca Calloway, the woman who had founded the family with her two brothers in 1891. Margaret read it in one sitting, her coffee growing cold beside her as the afternoon light faded from her office window. Rebecca's words painted a picture of desperation and delusion. She wrote about fleeing Virginia after Rebecca became pregnant by Thomas, about William's promise to protect them both, about the decision to hide in the mountains where no one would judge them or take the baby away. But what started as escape became prison. Rebecca wrote about the first signs of trouble, her son, born in 1892, who developed strangely, her daughter, born in 1894, who never learned to speak properly, the decision to keep the children isolated for their safety, the growing fear that outsiders would discover their secret and destroy them. The final entry was dated 1903. Rebecca wrote, "Thomas says the children must marry each other when they grow. He says it's the only way to keep the family pure, keep the secret safe. I am afraid. I see what is happening to our bloodline, but I am more afraid of the world beyond these trees. God forgive us for what we've started. God forgive us for what we cannot stop." Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands. The tragedy had begun not with evil, but with fear, with the desperate choice to hide rather than face judgment. And that choice had metastasized across generations, mutating into a belief system that justified the unjustifiable. 18 months after the intervention at Crooked Hollow Road, Margaret Brennan compiled her final report on the Calloway family case. The document ran to 237 pages, including medical records, genetic analysis, psychological evaluations, and outcome reports for each family member. It was the most comprehensive study of sustained close relative reproduction in modern American history. It was also a catalogue of suffering that would inform child welfare policy for years to come. The outcomes for the children varied dramatically. Jeremiah, the 7-year-old who had screamed for 16 hours, had made surprising progress. His foster mother, Carol, had discovered that he responded to animals. She introduced him to her therapy dogs, and slowly, painfully, Jeremiah began to emerge from his shell of terror. He learned to speak in short sentences. He learned to sleep in his own bed. He started attending a special education program where teachers marveled at his memory for natural patterns and animal behavior. The mountains had taught him things that schools never could. But Jeremiah would never be fully independent. The genetic damage was too severe. His cognitive development had plateaued at roughly the level of a 9-year-old. He would require supported living arrangements for the rest of his life. Still, he smiled now. He played. He experienced kindness without fear. In the measurement of small victories, this was enormous. Mary and Ruth, the teenage sisters, followed divergent paths. Ruth embraced the outside world with desperate hunger. She learned to read within 6 months. She devoured books, television, anything that showed her the life she had been denied. By age 17, she had earned her GED and enrolled in community college. She wanted to be a nurse, she told Dr. Park. She wanted to help people who had been hurt the way her family had been hurt. Mary, however, could not adapt. The trauma of removal had shattered something fundamental in her psyche. She experienced severe anxiety in public spaces. The sight of strangers triggered panic attacks. She begged to be returned to the mountain, to the house, to the only life she understood. When told the house had been condemned and demolished, she attempted to take her own life. She survived, but was transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility where she remained, as of Margaret's report, unable to function in the world she had been thrust into. The youngest children presented the most complex medical challenges. Little Emma, the 2-year-old who had been born with her organs partially external, underwent 3 reconstructive operations. Surgeons at Kentucky Children's Hospital worked for months to repair the damage that should have been addressed at birth. She survived the procedures, but would face medical complications for the rest of her life. Her development was delayed, her future uncertain. 2 of the children died during the 18-month period following intervention. 5-year-old Aaron, who had been nonverbal and severely cognitively impaired, succumbed to pneumonia. His immune system, compromised by genetic factors, simply could not fight the infection. 9-year-old Esther died during a routine operation to correct a heart defect. Her organs, formed from the same repeated genetic material generation after generation, had too many hidden flaws. The adult family members fared little better. Sarah Calloway, who had been the primary spokesperson during the intervention, was placed in an assisted living facility in Harlan. She never adjusted. She refused to participate in group activities. She spent her days staring out the window toward the mountains, toward the hollow where her house had stood. She died at age 34 from organ failure, the same condition that had killed her mother. Caleb, Sarah's brother-husband, outlived her by only 6 months. His twisted joints and damaged spine made movement increasingly impossible. He developed infections that antibiotics could not clear. His death certificate listed multiple contributing factors, but the root cause was written in his genes. The other adult siblings were scattered across facilities in eastern Kentucky. Most required full-time care. None achieved independence. The genetic catastrophe that had been building for 4 generations had left them with bodies and minds that could not sustain normal life. Dr. Foster published his findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics under the title Genetic Consequences of Sustained Consanguinity, a 4-generation case study. The paper became required reading in genetics courses across the country. It provided hard data on the cumulative effects of inbreeding, the rate at which genetic disorders amplify, and the point at which a closed population becomes genetically unviable. But beyond the statistics and genetic markers, Dr. Foster included something unusual in his conclusion. A paragraph about the human cost, about children born into circumstances they did not choose, about adults who knew no other way, about the terrible mathematics of genetics grinding against the stubborn hope of family. The Calloway case demonstrates that human genetics operates by immutable laws, he wrote. We cannot love our way past biology. We cannot preserve purity through isolation. The family paid a price measured in suffering that spans generations, and their story must serve as a warning about the cost of turning inward when nature demands diversity. Tomb. Margaret visited the site of the demolished Calloway house 1 year after Joshua's death. The county had cleared the structure and filled in the foundation. Nature was already reclaiming the space. Weeds and saplings pushed through the disturbed earth. The chicken coop had been hauled away. The scattered bones and rusted tools had been removed. She stood in what had been the front yard and tried to imagine Rebecca Calloway arriving here in 1891. A pregnant woman, terrified and desperate, choosing isolation over judgment. How could Rebecca have known that her choice would echo through 4 generations, that her fear would metastasize into a belief system that would damage dozens of lives? Margaret found a flat stone and placed it near where the front porch had stood. She had brought a marker and wrote on the stone, "The Calloway family, 1891-1987. May their suffering end here." It wasn't a proper memorial. There would be no official recognition of what had happened in this hollow. The family had lived in shadow and would be remembered in shadow. But Margaret needed to mark the spot, needed to acknowledge that real people had lived and suffered here, that their pain mattered even if the world would never fully understand it. As she drove back down Crooked Hollow Road for the last time, Margaret thought about the children who had survived. Jeremiah, with his therapy dogs. Ruth pursuing her nursing degree, the others scattered across Kentucky, some progressing, some merely existing, all carrying genetic scars they would pass to their own children if they ever had them. The bloodline had been broken, the cycle had ended, but the echoes would continue for generations to come. The true final chapter of the Calloway story did not end with the demolition of the house or the scattering of the family. It ended in a genetics counseling office in Lexington, Kentucky, 6 years after the intervention. Ruth Calloway, now 20 years old and in her second year of nursing school, sat across from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a genetic counselor specializing in hereditary conditions. Ruth had come seeking answers about her own future, about whether she could safely have children, about what legacy the 4 generations of closed bloodlines had written into her DNA. Dr. Martinez had Ruth's complete genetic profile spread across her desk, the results of extensive testing conducted as part of the ongoing medical monitoring of surviving Calloway family members. She chose her words carefully. "Ruth, you carry genetic markers for several serious conditions. The inbreeding coefficient in your DNA is significantly elevated. That means you have many matching genes from both your mother and father because they shared recent ancestry." Ruth nodded. She had educated herself over the past 6 years. She understood the science now in ways her parents and grandparents never could have. "What are my chances of having healthy children?" Dr. Martinez pulled up a probability chart on her computer. "If you have children with someone who is not a blood relative, someone from outside your family entirely, the risk decreases substantially but doesn't disappear. You're a carrier for several recessive conditions. There's approximately a 35 to 40% chance of significant genetic complications in any pregnancy. And if I don't have children, then the genetic cascade that began with your ancestors ends with your generation. The concentrated genetic load doesn't get passed forward." Ruth sat in silence for a long moment. Through the window she could see the University of Kentucky campus. Students walked between buildings, laughing, carrying books, living the normal life she had fought so hard to join. She thought about her sister Mary, still institutionalized, unable to function in the world. She thought about her younger siblings, some thriving against the odds, others diminished by the genetic burden they carried. She thought about little Emma, who would face medical complications for the rest of her life because of decisions made by people long dead. "I've been seeing someone," Ruth said quietly. "Marcus, he's in my anatomy class. He doesn't know about my family, about where I come from. I've been too afraid to tell him." Dr. Martinez leaned forward with compassion in her eyes. "Ruth, your past is not your fault. The circumstances of your birth were not chosen by you. But your future is yours to decide. If you choose to tell Marcus, you can explain the medical realities. If you choose to have children, we can provide genetic screening and counseling. If you choose not to have children, that's equally valid." "What would you do?" Ruth asked. "If you were me?" Dr. Martinez considered the question seriously. "I would remember that I am more than my genetics, that I have value beyond my ability to reproduce, that breaking the cycle of suffering is itself a profound act of love." Ruth left the counseling session with papers detailing her options, medical resources, and support groups for people with complex genetic histories. She walked across campus to the library where she had agreed to meet Marcus for a study session. He was already there, highlighting passages in a textbook, his face serious with concentration. When he looked up and smiled at her, Ruth made a decision. She would tell him. She would trust that the connection they had built over months of conversation and shared goals could withstand the weight of her history. She would give him the truth and let him choose. They talked for 3 hours in a quiet corner of the library. Ruth told him everything. The house on Crooked Hollow Road, the generations of isolation, the genetic catastrophe that had shaped her DNA, the siblings who had died, the siblings who survived but would never be whole, her own fears about the future. Marcus listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. "Ruth, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That happened to your family, but you're not your ancestry. You're the person who fought her way out of that hollow, who learned to read in 6 months, who's going to be an amazing nurse. That's who you are. But if we ever wanted children, then we'll face that decision together, with all the information and all the support available. Or maybe we won't have children. Maybe we'll adopt. Maybe we'll be the cool aunt and uncle to other people's kids. There's more than one way to build a family, Ruth." She cried then, relief and grief and hope mixing together. The final breath of the doomed bloodline was not a gasp of suffering, but a sigh of liberation. In the years that followed, Ruth Calloway became Ruth Sanders. She graduated with her nursing degree and took a position at a rural health clinic in eastern Kentucky. She and Marcus never had biological children. They adopted 2 boys from foster care, giving them the stable home and loving family that Ruth had been denied for the first 16 years of her life. She maintained contact with her surviving siblings, Jeremiah, now in his 20s, living in a group home and working part-time at an animal shelter. Little Emma, whose medical journey continued, but who had learned to draw beautiful pictures of mountains and forests. The others, scattered across Kentucky, each finding their own accommodation with the genetic hand they had been dealt. Mary remained institutionalized. Ruth visited her twice a month, sitting with her sister who could not adapt, reading to her from books Mary would never fully understand. It was Ruth's way of honoring the shared trauma while not being consumed by it. Dr. Foster's research on the Calloway family became foundational in genetics education. Medical students studied the case to understand the practical implications of inbreeding depression. Social workers used it as a case study in recognizing isolated populations at risk. The suffering of one family in the mountains of Kentucky had become a teacher to thousands. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler. It was in the way Ruth lived her life, with openness instead of isolation, with trust instead of fear, with the understanding that purity is not preserved through closure, but through connection, that the strength of a bloodline comes not from its concentration, but from its diversity. On warm summer evenings, Ruth sometimes drove out toward Harlan County. She never went all the way to where Crooked Hollow Road used to be, but she would park at a scenic overlook and look out at the mountains that had hidden her family's suffering for so long. She would think about Rebecca Calloway making a desperate choice in 1891, about all the children born into that hollow who never had choices, about the final breath of a bloodline that had suffocated under its own weight. And then she would drive home to Marcus and their adopted sons, to a house with electricity and running water and neighbors who waved hello, to a life lived in the light instead of the shadows, to the proof that cycles can be broken and that genetic catastrophes can end not in death but in the deliberate choice to live differently. The house that rotted alone in Appalachia was gone. The doomed bloodline had breathed its last. But the survivors carried forward a different kind of legacy, the knowledge that family is more than blood, that isolation destroys what it claims to protect, that the bravest thing we can do is open the doors we were taught to keep locked. If you've watched until this point, you've witnessed one of the most devastating genetic catastrophes in American history. Check if you're subscribed to this channel, because these stories of hidden suffering need to be told, remembered, and learned from. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly values these important stories. Hit the like button if this case impacted you, and share this video with someone who needs to understand the real cost of isolation. These families deserve to be remembered. Their suffering demands to be acknowledged, and only by facing these dark chapters of history can we prevent them from repeating. The final breath of the Calloway bloodline was taken, but the lesson lives on.